Oh, let's see. More reader. Okay. All right. So I wanted to start off with a little story and a little intro. Um, for those of you who don't know me, I have a lot of family in Central California, which, if you're not familiar with Central California, it's a big valley in the middle of the state. And most of the land there is used for agriculture. It's used to grow a variety of different crops, everything from lettuce and tomatoes to stone fruits like peaches and nectarines and grapes and citrus fruits. Just it's in some places in the town where my grandpa lives, it's called the nation's fruit basket. So this is an image of what it looks like flying overhead. You can see a lot of agricultural fields, in the distance, the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's also a pretty hot, arid region. So the picture on the right is a picture of me standing next to my grandpa's thermometer in the backyard, and you can see it's over 100 degrees on this particular day in July last summer. And the reason why I bring this up is because of how important this region is to our nation's food supply. The valley itself, it's about 20,000 square miles. Which is only about 0.6% of the total landmass of the continental US. But the agricultural products produced there in the valley actually make up 13% of the overall agricultural value of our nation's overall production. So it's a pretty important region, not just economically, but because it produces a lot of our nation's fruits and veggies. So we'll get to why that's important in a second. Another view of the valley. This is a vineyard for table grapes, not far from where my grandpa lives. And you can kind of see from the picture here that it looks sort of dry, it looks sort of dusty. And again, this kind of points back to the fact that the valley is a very hot place during the summer. That's also when a lot of things are grown. And so a lot of the crops there are actually irrigated. That's how they get their water, because it does not rain at all during the summer there. So there is a river just past the tree line in the distance there that helps irrigate a lot of these crops, but otherwise it's a pretty dry, dusty place. So, without water, that's one thing that is something that's going to be impacted by climate change. And then obviously our pollinators upon whom we rely in order to pollinate a lot of these crops. So the reason why we're here obviously today is to talk a little bit about climate change. And I think everyone here is familiar with, the gist of it. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. And what scientists are pointing to as one of the major driving factors for this climate change is human activity, particularly since the 1800s, is human activity, primarily burning fossil fuels. Obviously, as we enter the Industrial Revolution, and we started powering a lot more machinery, a lot of that machinery required coal and other sources of non-renewable energy in order to power, and that burning of those fuel resources contributes carbon and other things to the atmosphere. So the results of that, you can kind of see from this graphic here that I pulled from United Nations and the Xerces Society. The overall global average surface temperature of our Earth has steadily increased since about 1976 or so. There were some dips kind of above and below in terms of rising and falling. From about 1940 to 1980. But since that 1976 point, it's pretty much steadily increased all the way up to, on average, 1 degree higher than, that 1800 point. So it might not seem like a big deal to have the overall average surface temperature raised by 1 degree, but unfortunately, that impacts a lot of things. And a lot of things have gotten very adapted to living their lives with a certain temperature and with certain climate patterns. So that ends up having a large range of different effects. Now, I don't expect you all to read that box with all of those very wordy entries on some of the things that are affecting pollinators. So we'll kind of go through those together. So how are pollinators affected by this rising temperature and by these changes in weather patterns? So one kind of basic thing that I wanted to point out is that, the extreme weather that a lot of places are experiencing now, kind of increases in wildfires, heavy storms, flash flooding. My car was a total loss earlier this summer. I don't hope none of you were also caught in that flooding here in St. Louis, but these are the sorts of things that are happening in our environment now. And unlike us, bees cannot carry little umbrellas with which to shield themselves when they're trying to go about their business. And bees are not particularly adept at navigating our environments when it's a torrential downpour. So this is kind of a simple example, but basically these extreme weather events, whether it's hot droughts during the summer, or heavy rains, or excessive cold during the winter, or those up and down temperatures that we're seeing in the winter times, that makes for a more difficult life for our pollinators. During the summer and spring, when they're actively foraging, they might not be able to go as far or spend as much time gathering those resources for their young. I mentioned pollinators kind of briefly, but many of our plants, in order to reproduce, are reliant on these pollinators in order to visit them and move pollen from one flower to another. That's how our plants reproduce and are able to make fruits and make seeds. And whether that's a bee or a wasp or a fly or a hummingbird, or in some parts of the country, bats, a lot of them do fly. Not everything that pollinates needs to fly, but having to navigate those situations can be extremely challenging for our smaller pollinators. Going along with that, warmer winters, and that doesn't necessarily mean like a consistently warm winter, but I know all of you are familiar with some of those weird hot spells that we sometimes have during the winter time, and also some of those really, really cold temperatures as well. Those fluctuations in temperatures can really impact our pollinators, our insect pollinators, because a lot of them hibernate or overwinter in the soil. Some insects are maybe only living a season at a time, like certain worker wasps and things like that. But queens for social colonies, bees for solitary bees are overwintering in the soil, in plant stems, and places like that. And the way this impacts them is, if you're a bee and you're all tucked in for the winter time, you've got a good amount of pollen stores or energy stores for the winter that's supposed to see you through until the springtime. And all of a sudden it's an 80-degree day. You might wake up and you might be, ready to go, ready to start collecting food resources. But unfortunately, it's the middle of winter and there's nothing for you to eat. So this is a similar situation that unfortunately is happening with other animals too, including bats who are affected by white nose syndrome. Completely different story, but that does make it harder for our pollinators to make it through the winter time if they're inadvertently using up their natural stores, their natural kind of fat stores when they're getting thrown off by these different weather events. And this is actually a picture of a bumblebee queen. I think this was in England, but she has chosen to overwinter in a pot that somebody has kind of uprooted and discovered her. So be watchful. You might have some honeybee, or excuse me, I keep calling them honeybees. You might have some bumblebee queens hanging out in your pots. So another thing that affects pollinators is just the quality and the quantity of nectar and pollen that's being produced by plants. Some people might not realize that it's not the same year to year. Honey beekeepers probably are aware of this because yields for honey are impacted by the amount of nectar and pollen that these bees can collect. When conditions are drier or just not quite right for these plants, it can reduce the quantity of the nectar that they're able to produce and the pollen, as well as the quality. There are things about nectar and pollen that are obviously giving these bees, these other pollinators, enough nutrients for them to eat and for them to supply their young. And these weather conditions and these changes in patterns can have a negative impact on that. I thought that was really interesting because for me, I guess I had a tendency to think of plants as being not robots exactly, but you input certain things and then they output other things. But there's a lot more nuance to it that directly impacts our pollinators who are relying on these things for their food and for their ability to raise their young. Another really big thing that is affecting pollinators is the fact that with the changes in climate, it's causing shifts in growing seasons. Some of you who are avid gardeners might have noticed, certain things are maybe blooming earlier or blooming later, depending on, severity and weather conditions. And those weird shifts inadvertently impact all of the animals that rely on those plants, especially during the beginning of the growing season in the early spring. So what scientists have been finding is that certain plants are blooming at different times, and there's a whole range of different pollinator species. Some are more generalists. They can collect pollen and gather nectar from a variety of different plants. Some are specialists specifically focused on a particular type of plant. And if those are not in sync, if the bees, for example, are emerging at the wrong time, the plants have already bloomed and they miss that window, that can have huge negative impacts on those specialist bees. It can also cause a shift in our pollinators' ranges. All animals have they have this area that they're more commonly found, and that's usually reliant on other factors like their food sources. But with weather shifts, we found in certain species that that a warming environment is causing them to steadily move up farther and farther north to get into whatever climate was they're used to, basically. So things are shifting farther and farther north in a lot of at least in North America. So what I just kind of described is also referred to as spatial and phenological mismatch, where insects, pollinators are not in the same time, or it's not in the same place, and not in the same season time as you would typically expect. And one particular species that this has impacted is actually the monarch butterfly. I know a lot of folks are familiar with the fact that monarch butterflies are migratory, which is a pretty cool thing. But I would like to point out, for those of you who aren't aware, the monarchs that we're seeing migrating right now, I saw a fair few outside my front door this morning as I was coming home today for this presentation. Those monarchs are the ones that are making it all the way down to Mexico. And they're the ones that are going to be overwintering in Mexico, resting in the firs and the pine trees in the forest there. But those same butterflies, those are not the ones that we will be seeing in the return spring. Those butterflies that are making the journey right now are overwintering, and then they were going to be making a short trek up into Texas area, and they are actually going to be breeding there. And then their offspring are going to be making a further journey up back to Missouri and farther north. But the reason why I'm bringing up the monarchs is this is all dependent on the monarchs being able to find enough food resources in the form of nectar for the adults and in the form of leaves for the milkweed for the caterpillars. And if any one part in this process is thrown off, then caterpillars might not have food by the time monarchs are trying to make the return journey, and similarly along the way. So that can really disrupt things for species that are migratory, like the monarch. And just a really quick overview of just the overall population of the overwintering monarchs at some overwintering sites in Mexico. And unfortunately, due to a combination of factors, habitat loss and loss of food resources like the milkweed, the population of monarchs has taken a pretty significant dive, particularly the last few years. There's some really bad years in 2012 to 2015, and then it kind of rebounded a little bit. But the last few seasons have been rough for the monarchs, and this is actually this is the monarch population that overwinters in Mexico. There's actually another migratory population that overwinters in a few spots on the coast of California, and they're even worse off. So these are all very important things to consider if you care about our pollinators and if you care about our native species like the monarch. And then obviously, I've referred to bees a lot in this presentation already, but they really are just incredibly important for our food resources that we are so lucky to have here, in abundance. And what's interesting to note, most people know about honeybees, most people know about bumblebees, but there are over 400 species of bees in Missouri. Most of those are going to be fairly small and maybe not be super easy to tell apart from each other. But I just think that's wild that, we have over 400 species of bees. Some are more generalist, like I mentioned earlier. Some are very specialist. My favorite bee in the whole entire world is actually on here. It's the squash bee. They're specialists on like squashes and pumpkins and stuff like that. So I'm super excited right now. All their hard work earlier in the season is paying off in the form of lots of pumpkin flavored things. So this is just a really nice poster that's put out by Pollinator Partnership that kind of illustrates just all the different things that bees are pollinators for. And again, the list goes on and on and on, and we are super reliant on our pollinators in order to help us, in order to help grow the food that we need to eat. So obviously there are a variety of factors that are impacting our pollinators due to climate change and due to, things not syncing up appropriately. But the good news is that we can help. And it's not, for certain things are not as hard as you think. Probably the biggest way that the average person can have a positive impact on our pollinators is to help improve their habitats and help improve not just the quantity but the quality as well. We can do that by improving their overwintering and their nesting. We can certainly do that by planting native plants. I have been talking about native plants since I was in high school, so this is definitely one of my soapbox things. But native plants are the plants that are that have evolved and adapted to live in the certain areas wherever you may be. Wildflowers is one way that a lot of people describe them. And they also happen to support a lot of the native pollinators that have also co-evolved with them. And then an important thing that I read about, but me myself don't know as much about, but this is something that's really important in the Central Valley, is because they have such huge areas of land that they use for production for agriculture. There are methods that they can take to help improve soil quality, because soil can also act as a carbon sink. And we want to get that carbon out of the atmosphere and in other places so that it's not contributing to the warming of our atmosphere. So I threw a couple different or a few different logos up here for some really awesome groups that have a ton of really wonderful information on how we all can learn more about native plants and why it's important to support our native pollinators and to create new habitat. But these three are really good ones. And Grow Native in particular has a lot of excellent resources that can really lay it all out for you based on what I'm talking about today. They really flesh it out, and I highly recommend folks check them out. You can Google them, Grow Native, and their website should pop right up. So again, major bee, we have a number of different species of bees in Missouri, and these are just a few pictures of some of them. Most people know the honeybee in the top left and the bumblebee in the top right. There are multiple species of bumblebees, but we also have carpenter bees and longhorn bees, leafcutter bees, sweat bees, which are beautiful metallic green and yellow, and then digger bees and polyester bees. So one thing that I mentioned first off with our list of things that you can do to help is actually, it relates to their nesting. And what I thought was interesting, I didn't realize this, but of all our native bee species in the country, 70% are actually ground nesters. So it's not just yellow jackets that live in the ground. I know a lot of folks have stories about accidentally like mowing over a yellow jacket nest, and I know that's not a good experience. But a lot of our native bees are ground nesters as well, which means that we need to do what we can to support their nesting choices. And one of the easier ways to do that is apparently just leaving some bare soil open in certain areas that will bare loose soil that will give them a good spot to dig. And again, remember that these pollinators, they're pollinating all kinds of things. So it's important to consider them as well. Now, the other 30% of bees are stem nesters. And this is a really interesting thing that I actually didn't learn about until kind of later in my career. But leave some bare soil for the ground nesting bees. In the winter time and the fall time, this is particularly relevant. You can do two things to help support pollinator habitat. First thing, leave your leaves. I know that's kind of easier said than done for a lot of folks, and different neighborhoods have different rules about, breaking up leaves and stuff. But leaves are actually a wonderful, wonderful place for a lot of our, just wildlife to overwinter. Everything from bees, like I've been talking about, to salamanders, to luna moths and cocoons. They all rely on that leaf litter to serve as a blanket for them, so they can make it through the winter. Even if you're not able to just leave them wherever, if you have a spot in your yard where you can just kind of rake up a bunch of leaves and just kind of leave them in a pile over the winter. It's a great way to help support pollinator habitat as well as habitat for other animals. And then stem nesting bees. So 30% of bees actually nest inside the stems of dead flowers, young trees, things like that. And I know it can be a really hard thing to leave dead plant stalks up over the winter, but do your best to do that, because a lot of bees will actually utilize those stems, especially things like coneflower and kind of thick, sturdy stems, as a place to raise their young, and also overwinter. They'll spend the winter in there as well. So this is a graphic that I took from Grow Native's website. So again, please go there, check it out. And Xerxes as well. That's a nonprofit for invertebrate conservation. They're really great. It kind of runs you through the season of what to do. Leave them up over the winter, maybe cut them back kind of short during the spring, so they still have a little bit of real estate to lay their eggs and provision their young. And then the nice thing that's good to remember too is that if you've got perennials, they're going to grow up and they're going to hide those stems, so you're not going to really see them again for most of the growing season. But these are all really great and easy ways to kind of think about how to support the pollinators around your homes. And then really important, you have to grow things throughout all of the growing seasons: spring, fall, spring, summer, and fall. From the early blooming blueberry, this is a blueberry plant being pollinated by a bumblebee I took at the zoo, to common milkweed and prairie blazing star. I took these out in Western Missouri at a field work site that I do work at. And then right now, fall, it's time for goldenrod and aster. And these are all plants that kind of help support pollinators through the whole season. So they have those resources continually to rely on. You want to make sure that you cover all of that when you're thinking about plants that you might want to add to your yard. And then this is probably the most important thing that I want to kind of impress upon folks is that you don't need a lot of space to do things. I had potted native plants on my back patio in South City, St. Louis for 2 years when I was living in an apartment with no yard. But what we really want to do is we don't want our pollinators to be kind of left in little islands. We want them to be able to move from place to place, because expanding their ability to move across landscapes is what's going to allow them to seek out those areas that they need. Maybe a yard down the street is a little warmer than the yard where they're at now, and they can go there and they can get what they need, or vice versa. You're creating these microclimates across a gradient when you give them lots of different choices. You're also creating a larger potential for more gene flow between these populations, which is important for overall species health. You want to have robust genetics and a diversity in genetics in order to help these populations be able to adapt and survive. And this is a really nice graphic that I found that just refers to a program in St. Louis City, for those of you who are city residents, called Milkweeds for Monarchs. And these are all the monarch gardens that people have installed across St. Louis City. And what's nice about this is, yes, it's for monarchs, but they're also required to plant lots of plants for like nectar for the adult monarchs, which of course, lots of other pollinators utilize as well. But even in this urban area, there's all of these little habitats within that help create that bigger network of habitat for our pollinators. It's also important in urban areas because they're usually heat sinks. It's a lot hotter in the urban sphere because of all the pavement that absorbs the heat during the day. So helping create more space for plants to go is really important to combat that as well. And then obviously roadsides are super important. And kind of electrical spaces as well. This is a prairie restoration that my boss was working on a few years back. And it was restoring the area to become a really healthy functioning prairie system, which obviously creates lots of habitat for all manner of wildlife. So you can kind of guess based on what we've talked about that, this is kind of your typical kind of suburban, newish suburban area. I don't know where this picture is. It kind of looks like it might be Florida. But there's trees and there's grass, but you know what? I don't see a whole lot of flowers. So you can probably guess that this is not so good for pollinators. But look at all that potential. Look at all that space that you could use to plant these native plants that'll support our pollinators. This is not so good, but there's always potential. There's always room for improvement, and you can start really small. It doesn't have to be this big undertaking. So another really, really awesome resource by Grow Native is something that the zoo worked on as well. They're calling it the Pollinator Garden Menu Card, and it basically breaks down the planting season into spring, summer, and fall, and gives you a list of good native plant choices for what to plant in each of these seasons, as well as what kind of conditions they like, how big they get. And it's just a really handy reference. If you're not sure what to plant, choose one of these and try and choose one from at least one season, or at least one plant for each season, so you have that continual blooming period to support those pollinators. And again, it doesn't have to be too big. They have some recommendations here, but you can start anywhere. So another thing that I wanted to mention is, we can support our pollinators through improving their habitat, improving their ability to overwinter, and we can also reduce other stressors that they encounter. And one of those stressors is, in fact, pesticide use. Now, pesticides generally are not super species specific. So if a pesticide is supposed to kill a roach, it's probably going to kill a bee. And that's something that you want to be really careful about in your garden as well. And one of the reasons why this is so important, if you have to use it, you have to use it. Just be wise about how you go about it. But one of the reasons why this is so important is because for agricultural systems, obviously they combat pests on a larger scale, especially if they're growing one crop across many hundreds of acres. And scientists are projecting that a lot of those pest species are actually going to be benefited by an increase in temperature, and they are going to do even better. So the chances of farmers and other folks having to use more pesticides in order to counter these booms in pest populations is very likely. So if we can even dial back a little bit of that, I mean, obviously that'll help. Hopefully the farmers will be able to figure out a system where they're not solely relying on those pesticides to control those problems. But they do predict an increase in pesticide use overall because of climate change. So try really hard not to use that unless you have to. And obviously, the goal here is to help increase our pollinators' ability to adapt and to live with these changes in climate. I don't know how successful we're going to be at turning back the dial on some of these instances, and that's not my area of expertise. But we really want to do what we can to increase the resilience of our pollinator populations. And the way we do that is by some of the methods that I described. So I had two pictures here that I really liked. The one on the left, obviously, it's a really pretty stepping stone path. But I want you folks to think about your yard. If you've got a yard, or your balcony, if you don't have a yard, think about your space as a stepping stone that helps connect pollinators from place to place to place to place. Obviously, it's nice if it's continuous, but a stepping stone is better than nothing at all. And you have that power to be able to change your plot of land, or your business or your school or wherever you may have some space to plant something, and transform that into a place where our pollinators can live, and hopefully that'll help them adapt to these changing climates. And then the picture on the right is, again, it's an example of that. This is a backyard of someone who's part of a backyard program that just started through the St. Louis Wild Ones group. Basically, you pay a very small donation fee to tour some of these private residences' backyards or yards to show what a native pollinator or native plant garden looks like. And I thought this was really nice because I chose this. You can search by size, and I chose a small yard. I'm not sure where exactly this is, but it's not a whole lot of space. It's along a fence line. I counted probably at least 10 plants within that space. And look at the difference between this yard and the one right over the fence. Some people like grass, and you know what? That's their choice. But I will say that this grassy yard is probably not going to support nearly as many pollinators and nearly as much wildlife as the yard with the black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers and some other things in there that I can't really quite tell. Native plants are great. I like non-native plants as well. But if you're wanting to support pollinators, definitely look into the native plants. And then I guess what I would like to leave you with, I think I probably have a good amount of time for questions, actually. But what I'd like to leave you with is, remember that your space, your yard, that's a refuge for our pollinators. It doesn't have to be super big. These are all pictures from my yard. I moved into a house about a year and a half ago. And these are all native plants that are, naturally occurring in Missouri, and a really pretty picture of a fiery skipper, which I just liked. But I'm trying to do my part. I've been waiting for a yard for probably since I moved out of my house and when I went away to college, and I am wasting no time. So I'm happy to champion native plants. And you'd be amazed at just the amount of wildlife that comes through your yard once you start planting some of these plants that support our native wildlife. So with that, thank you all for being here and listening to me chat. And I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Kayla, thank you so much. We had a question very early on in your presentation from Linda Smith. And she had asked about the type of pollinators. Now, I know in the presentation you did share a nice slide that gave some of the differences of the bees, but would you like to?
Yeah, let me look at the chat here so I can read her question. Okay, so types of pollinators. So if you mean like species, yes, there are many different types of pollinators, mostly insect, but not just. Obviously all the different species of bees that I mentioned, but wasps are also pollinators as well. Some people are surprised to hear that because there's lots of little graphics that go around that talk about wasps being jerks and not good for anything, but a lot of them are actually. I also mentioned hummingbirds being pollinators for certain flowers as well. They're one of the bird pollinators that we have locally here. And in the Southwest, a lot of bats are pollinators for a lot of night blooming flowers. And for us here in Missouri, a lot of moths are pollinators for those night blooming flowers as well. I didn't mention that in my talk. In addition, there are some mammalian pollinators, not nearly as prominent here, but in other areas as well. So there's quite a few. I think in some instances, lemurs serve as pretty good pollinators in Madagascar, but I don't know the specifics of that. I'd have to chat with someone else. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. We have lots of questions coming in, which is fantastic. We have a question from Cynthia Welsh. How long do we leave stems up after winter?
Oh, sure.
And is it safe to assume the overwintering pollinators have flown?
So let me try and go back to my, I forgot my last slide. I love this picture because it shows not only our pollinators like really big and beautiful and you know, in your face, but they're also so small. They're also teeny tiny. This, I believe, is the type of small carpenter bee on my bee balm. So with that, let me go back to the stem illustration, because I want to say that the best time is actually, you can leave them up all winter and cut them back kind of in mid spring, I want to say. I want to say like probably by April or so, you're probably good to cut the stems down. But you want to leave them at different heights if you can, just so that you're providing nest cavities for any bees that might want to move in, because they actually some bees like really long cavities, some like shorter cavities. Yeah, springtime, mid spring.
Thank you so much. Then we also have a question from Linda Smith. Could you please discuss invasive bee species and if they are a problem?
Sure. So we do have some non-native bees. Certain types of polyester bees are not native. Honeybees technically are not native. Some people will call them invasive. Maybe not invasive, but they aren't native bees. They were actually brought over with European settlers back in the 1600s, I want to say. For the most part, we don't have a ton of what I would consider problematic invasive bees. We don't have to deal with the Africanized honeybees like they do in like the Southwest. But we do want to be careful about there is a species of sort of, it's called naturalized when a species has been here so long that it's not super invasive, but it's just here. And that would be the European hornet. That's one that doesn't cause too much trouble for the most part. But I'm trying to think. I recognize the question. We don't have too many like super damaging invasive bees that I can think of. I could be wrong. I could be blanking on something. But I would say for the most part, you don't have to worry about it. What's more important is to support pollinators. And if you happen to have some of these non-native bees utilize your resources too, which they may, it's not a big enough problem to really, try and mitigate at least.
That was great. Thank you. We have another question from Cynthia Welsh. She has been collecting leaves for her yard and from her neighbor's yard for several years to compost into black gold mulch. How can I balance that need with the benefit of leaving the leaves in a place for the pollinators?
Oh, that's a great question. That's exciting to hear that you've been composting, because that's a wonderful way to use those resources. I feel bad when I see bags of leaves on the curb because I wish I had the space to do that. That's a really good question. I would say, if you've got, even if you leave like a little area, I would say whatever makes sense for you to leave. The nice thing about composting, I don't know how specifically you're composting, but it at the very least gives certain things an opportunity to use that for the time that you might have it. But it doesn't have to be a huge space. If you're limited on space, just what I did this past fall is I kind of just raked a bunch of leaves into some of my planting beds and just kind of left them there. But I would say do what you can. And I wouldn't worry too much about, using your neighbor's leaves as a source for compost, especially if they're going to otherwise, end up raked up and taken to the curb.
Thank you. I also have a question on the regard of leaves. So our HOA is very particular about having too many leaves on the yard. So last winter we mulched the leaves. Is that as helpful, or is better just to rake them into a pile? And
I would say if you can just rake them into a pile, it's probably a little bit better, just because when you're mulching the leaves, depending on how finely you're mulching, there might be things in there that may or may not make it through a mulcher. So usually I would say better to return those leaves to the soil than to not. But if possible, maybe try and do a bit of both if you're able to cut down on the mulching per se, if that makes sense.
that makes total sense. Thank you. All right, we've got 2 more questions, and these have been great questions. Thank you so much. We have a question about a backyard and some prairie conversion. So we have set aside approximately 25 by 25 square foot area in our backyard for a prairie. A commercial company is setting it up. Any resource to verify that we are doing it right?
That's wonderful. What a cool undertaking. I would direct you to the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and also I want to say Prairie Moon Nursery. They're up in Minnesota, but they have some resources for folks who are interested in doing that same thing. So they talk a lot about wanting to clear the land, and you want to like solarize it or cover it in such a way so that your young prairie seeds don't have as much competition. And then there's a process of like mowing to get certain things established, et cetera, et cetera. But Missouri Prairie Foundation and Prairie Moon Nursery, those are 2 resources that should be able to help you parse out whether or not you're on the right track.
That is great. Thank you. And I'm excited for that family. That's awesome to
Yeah, that's
so
very
much
cool.
area that you can set aside. That's perfect. And one last question that we have from Linda Smith. What about cutting our grass or leaving it long?
Oh, good question. So from what I know, um, leaving grass a little longer is nice, especially if you happen to have clover or other flowering plants in that mix. Because most clovers that you're going to see in a lawn aren't a native plant, but they do provide pollen and nectar to a lot of our pollinators. So I tend to not discourage it in my own yard. So if you are able to leave your lawn a little longer, especially at the beginning of the season when there might not be a whole lot of other nectar resources. I've heard some people talk about no mow May, which I think is a really cool idea. But I think it might be a little bit better to do that in more northern climates compared to Missouri, because I'm pretty sure if we left our lawn and we didn't mow it until May, we might not have been able to mow through it. But if you're able to leave it a little longer, especially during the springtime when some of those early plants like dandelions, which also aren't native, but they're naturalized, they're not going anywhere, and they do provide food resources for our pollinators, is a good idea. And that's mostly it. And it's also kind of nice for other insects too, like grasshoppers and crickets and things like that. They'll eat grass and they like it a little longer.
That is great. Thank you so much, Kayla.
Mhm.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A or in the chat. But I do want to say thank you so much. I know there's been such amazing work going on with our Native Pollinator Center, and we actually, with native songbirds, there is such an amazing overlap. So it's so easy to talk to people about native songbirds because practically everything that you do to help your pollinators is also helping those birds out. So it's so great that we already have that fantastic resource.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, many native plant groups talk about ways to garden for pollinators specifically, birds specifically, but there's a ton of overlap. What's really nice about a lot of our native plants is they serve, multiple roles, whether it's caterpillar food, which will eventually, those caterpillars will become moths, our butterflies, our food for birds and songbirds and things like that. That's probably the biggest takeaway is it's all kind of connected. So what's good for things I like, well, I like birds too, but you know what I mean. Is also good for other wildlife as well.
All right, so we have one final question that's
Oh, okay.
not necessarily on this topic, but kind of on the topic. We had a question wondering how each of us got into our careers.
Oh, very cool. So I went to school for natural resources. I knew I always wanted to work with animals in some fashion, but I wasn't really sure what or how. And while I was in school, I ended up taking some courses in entomology, which is the study of insects. Which I thought were super fascinating and made me realize there was this whole like other group of animals that I didn't really know a whole lot about, and they were like most of the animals like on this earth. So I got really into insects from that point on, and worked in a behavior lab studying spiders and taking care of the spiders, and that directly led me to a seasonal keeper position at the zoo in the insectarium, and I kind of worked my way up from there. So definitely doing what I went to school for, which I know not a lot of people can necessarily say. So I feel very lucky and grateful.
That's great. I have a similar journey. I did environmental biology for my undergrad. I had an early epiphany in my early years that we went to the Brookfield Zoo and I saw a dolphin show. I think I was like 7 or 8. And I was like, that's it. I want to teach at a zoo. At first I thought I wanted to be a dolphin trainer. And then I realized I'm really not a great swimmer. So then, doing education was going to be my focus. And then I got out of college and I moved to St. Louis because there was more job opportunities, and got on with Department of Conservation, and then got on with the zoo a couple years later. So, and I've been here ever since, and I love it.
Nice, Gary.
I think at this time we're going to kind of wrap up. We want to thank everyone for joining us, and we want to thank Kayla for the fabulous presentation and the amazing information. And I also want to remind everyone that for the next 3 days, we have climate change webinars, same time. So please feel free to join us for that. And if you are local, please join us on Sunday as we celebrate Climate Solutions Day at the zoo from 10 to 3. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions or want to see this recording again, we will have it on our website at the stlzoo.org and /climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.